Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa. And as Algeria marks 60 years of independence from France, we take a closer look at the deep diplomatic and social tensions that exist between and within the two countries, from the enduring pain over atrocities committed during colonial rule to calls for reform from within Algeria. The country's had a bumpy 6 decades, and yet July 5th, the official date of independence, still sparks a deep, if complex, sense of pride for many Algerians. After 132 years of brutal occupation by France, July 5th, 1962, Algeria broke free of colonial rule following 8 years of devastating conflict. On Tuesday, the 60th anniversary was celebrated in Algiers with its first military parade in 33 years. Leaders from Tunisia, Ethiopia and Niger were amongst those joining Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune for the event. For many Algerians, the emotional date offers a chance to remember those who fought for freedom.
For me, this is like a wedding for Algeria, the Independence Day. We are so happy to see what Algeria has become, with its youth, its people, its government and its army. May God protect this country and keep away our enemies.
My father brought me to this parade when I was 5 years old, so I wanted to bring my kids here. Thank God this dream came true. Today is our Independence Day. This is a day that gives hope to our children and our youth, and the hope in this country's future. There is nowhere better than this country.
We're independent as a result of the sacrifices of the martyrs and fighters. May God bless their souls. It's because of the army and the people's sacrifices that we're living in peace today.
So a big day for those attending that parade there in Algeria. Look back now, though, at Algeria's first day of post-colonial independence.
July 5th, 1962. A jubilous day for Algerians. 132 years after the capture of Algiers by the French, the country claims back its sovereignty. Men, women and children parade festively in the streets, waving flags of the FLN, the National Liberation Front. The day marked an end to French colonisation, but also to more than 7 years of war. The result of a nationwide vote 4 days earlier.
À l'ouverture du scrutin, les musulmans se pressaient au bureau de vote. Dans toute l'Algérie, on enregistrait une participation électorale importante à plus de 85%. La majorité des Européens présents a pris part au scrutin.
At the time of the vote, many European settlers had left the country. Despite a ceasefire agreement signed in March 1962 with the Evian Accords, violence had surged in Algeria. The clandestine secret army organisation refused to let go of the country and pursued a scorched earth policy, multiplying its attacks on the Muslim population. On Independence Day, unknown shooters sparked bloodshed in the city of Oran.
Au cœur de la cité, alors que l'excitation battait son plein, une fusillade avait éclaté. Une fusillade qui a fait près de 100 morts et plus de 150 blessés parmi les deux communautés.
It's believed that closer to several hundreds were killed or went missing, with demonstrators settling scores with Europeans, as the French army and the National Liberation Army both stood by.
Le drame avait figé la ville dans l'angoisse.
Another source of tension at the time, divisions within the new government, with leaders of different political factions clashing over the future of the country.
L'accord n'est toujours pas fait entre Ben Bella d'une part, Boudiaf et Belkacem Krim d'une autre, et Ben Reda d'une troisième.
The provisional government ultimately gave ground to the future president Ahmed Ben Bella, with the support of Colonel Boumediene, head of the so-called Algerian Border Army. Together, they would enter Algiers in September and oust their rivals, their victory triggering the rise of military power.
So for more on this, I'm joined now by Miriam Halle Davis, who's an Associate Professor of History at UCSC and the author of Markets and Civilization, Islam and Racial Capitalism in Algeria. Miriam, thanks so much for speaking to us. So As we can see there's still a lot of excitement about July 5th in Algeria. Do you think that all the hope and promise of Algerian independence has delivered over the last 60 years or so?
Well, I have to say it's touching just to hear those stories and see those images. The question of whether the promises of independence have been met is, of course, a loaded one, but I would say absolutely. The goal of the War of Independence and the revolution was to give Algerians a sovereign nation state where Algerians could be in control of their own destiny. And that is certainly the case. As the clip mentioned, it's important to remember the conditions in which Algerians embarked on this revolution, the extreme violence of colonialism, and also the decades during which Algerians demanded reform that were never delivered by France. So in terms of achieving a nation state, absolutely, the goals have been achieved. Now, does this mean that all Algerians are happy with the status quo or that the regime is beyond critique? Absolutely not. And that has been evident in the last few years. But certainly there's a long list of countries where we could identify a kind of mismatch between the founding values of the country and the actual practices and policies on the ground at the moment.
How has the history of Algerian independence affected its relationship with France in particular? You know, this 60th anniversary comes after a particularly tense time between the countries that kind of peaked last year. And even considering Algerians still living in France, why do you think the relationship is still so fraught?
Yeah, that's a great and difficult question. Of course, you know, the extreme violence of colonialism has to be taken into account. The 132 years was one in which there was extreme poverty among indigenous Algerians and a real destruction of Algerian culture and traditions. You know, the recruitment camps and the systematic use of torture, all of these things that have come to light recently have been difficult to digest, I think, for the French state. There's also the history of immigration in France after 1962, when France very much needed the labor of ex-colonized individuals, particularly from Algeria, to rebuild after World War II. And of course, we know that in the 1970s, the economic changes meant that this climate was a bit different, and we saw an uptake in anti-Arab racism in the early 1970s. And you add to all of that the current French policies and the current French political moment in which immigration and questions of Islam have really become a kind of hot button issue. So I think all of this contributes to making Algeria a difficult subject sometimes to talk about.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for talking us through that. I'm going to ask you to stay with us as we have a look at some of the other issues touching upon Algerian independence. Now, that actually followed an 8-year war of independence, which over 1 million Algerians were killed. Thousands were arrested by the French authorities during the conflict and were never seen again. Known as the disappeared, some families are still searching for answers.
This is my father. I remember him as someone who was very loving. My children are a bit like him, but I don't know where he is. On November 30th, 1957, I was 7 years old. My father was taken at 5 a.m. We weren't allowed to leave the room. We stayed in our beds. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, still nothing. He still hadn't come back. At 10 a.m., my mother sent us into town and told us, go see your uncles and tell them that your father left this morning at 6 a.m. with policemen in civilian clothing who know him, but he hasn't come back. Do they know something? So we went to see one of my uncles who said, listen, he's not the only one. It happened to 17 people at the same time. It's for an inspection. But then there was nothing. Nothing. We went through some very difficult years, especially as children. Me, I was 7 years old. I met other girls who told me my father was put in prison too. He stayed there for 5 years. I replied, but you still have your father. Even if he was there for 5 years or for 10 years, you still have him. You can't compare yourself to me. Or others who told me their father was killed by the secret army organization in the street. Yes, but you saw the body. You saw him buried. You can't compare it. It's not the same thing. We're left wondering, where is he? It doesn't matter. I know he's not coming back, so it doesn't matter. But we would be able to mourn him properly if we knew where he was.
So, Miriam, I'm going to ask you to come back to us now. What, in your opinion, will it take to repair some of that, or if it's even possible to repair some of the open wounds that still exist in terms of the relationship between Algeria and France?
Yeah, I thought it was so powerful in the clip, the demand not for apologies, but for answers. And in that regards, there has been amazing research done by French and Algerian researchers trying to give these families answers. But I think your question is perhaps a broader one in that, how do we make sense of these claims? And there we do have precedents from other colonial contexts, which is a discussion around reparations. Britain paid almost 200 million pounds to Kenya, Germany also in Namibia. And I say reparations not because this is about, healing the wounds of individuals, which I don't think can be done with money, but indeed with bringing up the structural legacies of colonialism in France and making this conversation a bigger one, not just about individuals, but about how the French state indeed continues to be informed by colonial practices and ideas. And so that's one possible line of analysis for that question.
Now, the pain and suffering and the determination of Algeria's fight against oppression actually echoed other liberation struggles around the world at the time. How much global significance do you think that the Algerian Revolution had in the 1950s and 60s?
I mean, it's almost incredible to think about it today, where we tend to be a bit jaded about these revolutionary movements. But the revolution in Algeria was a model for countries in Africa, in Europe, the Middle East, Asia. It was really the shining beacon and hope of many people of what could be achieved after colonial oppression. And so this was about military training and material support as well, but it was also about the ideas of what it meant to create a world that was more just, not only economically and politically, but also culturally, and an attempt to rethink, what does it mean to be a revolutionary away from the kind of oppressive structures of Stalinism and the USSR. And so, into the 1970s, people called Algeria the Mecca of revolutionaries. Palestine, Yugoslavia, the American Black Panthers spent time in Algiers. So it's really a story that meant a lot to revolutionaries and activists around the world.
Well, off the back of that, what you've just flagged up, Miriam, so we see that the Algerian independence movement blazed a new trail for not only revolutionary movements off the continent, but others on the African continent fighting back against colonialism. South African anti-apartheid hero Nelson Mandela actually once said that it is Algeria that made me a man. So from 1962, he organised training camps there for the armed fight against apartheid in his country. And our correspondents sent us this report.
We found him in a village in Limpopo. He is one of the first members of the military wing of the ANC, formed by Nelson Mandela in 1961.
Veteran Campbell Ora Malaba. He is my father, actually my hero.
Few men from the Malaba family survived the fights against apartheid. Roy was 17 years old when he enlisted. In 1963, the ANC sent him to train in Algeria.
Algeria, we learned a lot of things. We learned guerrilla warfare, urban warfare, homemade explosives. They were teaching us. We were training there. Those people, they couldn't understand English. We had some interpreters who were assisting us. I am a member of the Tuli detachment.
South Africans were training in Algeria with other fighters from Southern Africa, Zambians and Mozambicans. A year before Roy's arrival, Nelson Mandela had been invited to Algeria by President Ben Bella. Mandela planned the ANC's Algeria training camps with the country's Minister of Defence, Colonel Houari Boumediene. Roy remembers his time there very well. He even told us a little secret.
Boumediene This is Mandela. Mandela understand he has left also his boots, they are still in Algeria, military boots. They said were going to send them. What happened to the boots of Mandela?
The former freedom fighter was drawn to Algeria's socialism at the time. He's disappointed that those revolutionary ideals no longer exist, even in today's South Africa.
The founders of this liberation movement, they are worried. What is happening? Corruption, people in high positions. They exploit poor people that are having nothing.
Comrade Malaba has written his memoirs. They're titled, "We Did Not Fight for This."
Well, before we leave you, I'd like to say a massive thank you to Mariam for sharing all your insight and expertise on this day of Algerian independence. And thank you all for joining us for this special. Before we leave you, finally, as a warm-up to the independence celebrations on July the 5th, French-Algerian artist DJ Snake got the party started a few weeks back with his single Disco Maghreb. It's a tribute to the label that produced some of the biggest stars of the Algerian rhyme music in the 1980s. He said that the release is a love letter to his people. So we'll leave you on a high note. Thanks for watching. Do so again. Take care.